very much, Kieran. Can everyone hear me at the back? Okay, we've not got a radio mic. You can hear me okay. My teacher voice is still working. That's good news. First of all, thank you to Kieran for the promotion. This often happens. I get referred to as Dr. Neil McLennan. Despite all the research work, I've never put it together for a PhD, and the professors at the university are desperate for me to do that. So I need to do that at some time, maybe after 2018 and all the lectures have finished. So a huge thank you to Hannah at the outset, who sadly can't be here tonight, and I'm sure our best wishes go to her for a speedy recovery. But Hannah's been instrumental in setting up tonight and making the connections. I first met Hannah almost 2 years ago now, when I was recording for the History Scotland magazine podcast series, and we covered a podcast on the history of golf here at the Golf Museum. So huge thanks and best wishes to Hannah. Thank you to Kieran and Laurie, who've stepped into the position very well and looked after us since we've arrived here this afternoon in St Andrews. So the topic of the lecture tonight, in 2017, the impact of three relatively minor, one might say, fines added to an already planned set of commemorations, as Kieran said, for the war poets being in Edinburgh, commemorating 100 years on from them being in Edinburgh and in Scotland. Those events were arranged by a committee of veterans organisations, arts organisations and educational organisations. Some 25 in total organisations contributed, and there was 18 events over the period from the summer to the end of 2017. Now, as part of that calendar of events, there was a full schedule of various different activities, including sellout lectures given by Catherine Walker as part of the Edinburgh International Book Festival. We had a re-screening of the film Regeneration as part of the film festival. There was historic walks in the Pentlands. There was a recreation of Wilfred Owen's journey from London to Edinburgh on the night train. It's the first time I've ever lectured on a night train, so slightly different. We also had a commemorative walk with the Lord Provost leading a walk along Princes Street, recreating Owen's footsteps as he arrived in the capital. And in total, between all of those events and the event we held at Barberton Golf Club, we believe that we touched around about 11,000 people, as well as extensive print and broadcast media coverage. Now, the research finds hit Yahoo News, they hit American news, and they hit mainland European news as well. But tonight you're going to hear a bit about that, but you're also going to get two for the price of one, because Catherine and I have become a bit of a double team over 2017. And my good friend Catherine Walker, who's, as you heard, been part of the War Poets commemorations, part of the Wilfred Owen commemorations, is also the absolutely superb curator of the War Poets collection at Edinburgh Napier University. And that is the site of Craiglockhart, where the war hospital was, where the war poets were, along with many other officers as part of the recovery from shell shock. So tonight you're going to hear about the activities and the events at Craiglockhart generally, to set it in context. And in the second part, I'm going to set it into a bit more detail on the golf course meeting, particularly how we found this meeting, people have said in the media, was the most prominent literature meeting of the 20th century, happened in a golf club, and why there was a golfing connection to that. Thereafter we'll close, and the real gem is the discussion, the question and answers afterwards, and the discussion, because I'm sure there are lots of people have questions, but also stories to tell as well as we go into question and answer. But for now, I'm going to welcome Catherine Walker, MBE.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, can I say, can you hear me as well? I'm not as loud as Neil. Okay. Firstly, thank you again to Kieran and Laurie for welcoming us here this evening. I should say, first of all, that I'm not a golfer, and my only link to the world of golf is that I come from Wallingford in East Lothian, the home of Willie Park Senior. My nephew's actually a descendant of Willie Park, so no pressure there for a Sunday golfer. When I was at primary school, my teacher used to say that I had been vaccinated by a gramophone needle. So I like to keep this slide I'm here to just remind me that I should be a bit more succinct and try and answer these questions about the collection at Edinburgh and Napier University. So hopefully, without further ado, I'll stay focused on the topic and introduce you to our Craiglockhart campus. For those of you who are unfamiliar to Edinburgh, the district that our campus is in is a quiet and quite well-to-do area of Edinburgh. Craiglockhart is often used, however, as a shortcut for this building. Now, as you can see, it has two very distinct halves. When I'm being really fanciful, it reminds me of the two faces of the Roman god Janus, one facing towards the future and one facing towards the past. So for those of you who are familiar with Edinburgh, the building sits on the crossroads of Glenlockhart Road and Collington Road. We already owned two campuses at this point when we bought Craiglockhart in the mid-1980s, and we now have something like 20,000 students. When we bought the campus in the mid-1980s, we realised that we were not only buying the building, but we were also buying into a piece of history. The British Council asked must be 1987, if they could show an exhibition within our building about the poets of the Great War. So this highlighted really the importance of the building and our connections to it, and a continued interest in Craiglockhart campus. And as you can see from the slide, one of our more famous visitors to this small temporary exhibition was the Princess Royal. She's very recognisable, don't think she's changed much to this day. The then Professor and Principal, Bill Turmo, decided that what the university needed was a permanent exhibition of some sort, a permanent marker to remind people of the unique history that our building has. Craiglockhart has contributed to the worlds of psychiatry, education, poetry, military and nursing history, as well as general medical history, and the poets themselves, of course. The exhibition that we have tells the story of the building throughout the years and through the items that we've collected, and we are still collecting today. When we first started to collect in 1988, the original collection was kept in a wooden bookcase in the library. We also had an associated display in the main corridor with graphic panels and books and very basic things. It was really all very low tech. What we also had was lots of red crepe paper, a pile of soil, and a wooden cross from a local undertaker. That was as fancy as the display became. But as you can see now, what we have is a very small, dedicated exhibition space in what was the main entrance and exit to the building. For those of you who have read Regeneration, I was speaking to the gentleman earlier, Pat Barker, the author, describes the building, and she describes these very distinctive black and white marble tiles in the foyer. In 2016, to mark the centenary of the opening of the hospital, we were delighted to also add, apart from having books and journals and photographs and film in this small area, we were delighted to add some audio as well. So we now can listen to the poetry and the prose connected to the building by using the very distinctive voices of Sir Daniel Day-Lewis, Nathaniel Parker, Alan Little, Ian McLennan, the performance poet, and Pat Barker herself. We are open to the public for individual and group visits. So really, I should tell you why we're collecting and what we've collected. This is one of the earliest things that we do have in the War Poets collection. So our story really starts with this illustration from the British architect, depicting how the building looked when it was first constructed in 1880. The building opened as a hydropathic. Now, does everybody kind of know what hydropathic does? Being Scotland, we liked hydropathics. A hydropathic building was one where people came to take the waters, both internally and externally, to make them feel better, feel well. I have heard a description of it as being for the worried wealthy, but that's maybe not quite true. They had lots of treatments, such as swimming pools, Turkish baths, and something called a galvanic bath, which was where you ran a very small current of electricity through water, and apparently it was good for things like rheumatic joints. Personally, I think that sounds a bit dangerous, but that's what a hydropathic did. So the hydropathic was built by Peddy and Kinnear and opened in April 1880. It's a Grade B listed building. So when we moved in, this was more or less how it looked. We've not really altered it very much at all. It's described as Italianate in style with a central tower. It had, as I said, a swimming pool, a theatre, an abundance of leisure facilities. And it cost, any guesses, in 1880? £46,000. Which is approximately 5.3 million today. So this is how the building looked, and the earliest thing we have from the collection itself regarding the hydropathic is this visitor's banner, or silk. We're not quite sure what it was actually meant for, whether it was purely an advertisement or whether it was meant to be a lady's scarf. We're just not sure, so we framed it and put it on the wall anyway. It gives us a fantastic glimpse of life in the hydropathic. The central panel, which you won't be able to read unless you've got extremely good vision, tells you about what happened in the building during the day. So in the morning, people met for prayers. They could go and do various activities during the day. They could take trips into town and further afield. And they met in the evening and had meals together. The interesting part, roundabout, is that the advertisers who are advertising in the hydropathic continue to advertise in the Hydra, the magazine of the War Hospital, and some still exist today. So I don't know if you can see if this pointer works. Charles Jenner and Company, who of course now are probably going to be known as Sports Direct, Princess Street. Gray's in George Street, who have only recently closed down. Kroll's the Garage are still in existence. My favourite one, if I can get the pointer to work, is this one, Thornton's, Will It Rain? It's Edinburgh, don't be silly, of course it's going to rain. So the hydropathic banner gave us a lot of information about what was going on in the building. The hydropathic wasn't hugely successful. There were lots of hydropathics in Scotland, Dunblane, Peebles, Morningside. There were quite a number of them. But the Craiglockett hydropathic had borrowed far too much money. They overextended themselves, and they were sold on to a man called James Bell, who came from Dunblane hydropathic. James Bell began to turn their fortunes around. He rebranded the hydropathic as the Edinburgh hydropathic. And just as he was beginning to be successful, the war years intervened. So in 1916, the War Office took over the building. They requisitioned the hydropathic, which must have been a perfect building in so many ways. The building was in a rural location. It had lots of facilities and peace and quiet. So when they requisitioned it, it was really for the use of officers only. And this beautiful little drawing that we have comes from an autograph book which was belonged to one of the VADs, the Voluntary Aid Detachment nurses who nursed at Craiglockett War Hospital. Basically, the idea is, what do you do to qualify to be sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital. So apart from seeing stars, as this poor soldier is obviously doing, you had to be an officer. This is our copy of the admissions and discharge register. The original is held at Kew, but we're allowed to keep this copy from the Public Records Office, now known as the National Archive, because of the significance of our Craiglockhart building. This is not the only book. We have about 8 or 9 admission and discharge registers, and we're very, very lucky that they survived both wars, because a lot of documents were lost, of course, in the Second World War through bombings. But this document survives, and it details the 1,801 officers who were sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital between the years of 1916 and 1919. Now, you'll note Craiglockhart wasn't opened as a hospital in 1914 because at that time the military could cope with the amount of people coming back to be treated. But in 1916, when the big battles are meaning that there's lots of injuries and lots of psychological injury, the War Office needed to establish more hospitals. So requisitioning Craiglockhart allowed them more space. In the register, if your name is James Brown, John Smith, whatever, we really can't do very much with your name. But lots of these men had quite unusual names. So if your name was Humphrey Cotton Minchin, or Lieutenant Blood, or Captain Lazarus, we've been trying to track back some of these more unusual names to see if we can find out the stories behind what happened to these men after the war. It gets complicated in some of the admissions books as well, because someone had the idea of writing M's and N's upside down. So if you had a name like McLennan, it's really difficult to decipher. But we have found out the backstories of quite a few other officers apart from the well-known ones. The book also gives you an awful lot of detail. The military used to write things expressed in fractions. So in one of these columns, this one here, is the length of service that an officer has had. So if it's 2.5 years, it's 2 6/12. So they don't make things easy for us, really. And mostly the diagnosis was neurasthenia, which was the military's preferred term for what you and I would have referred to as shell shock. The doctors treated 174 patients at any given time. So, it was a fair number of people in one building. We have lots of men who had military crosses, and although the men often felt that they were being perceived as cowards or shirkers in some way, we also have 2 holders of the Victoria Cross, James Leach and James Pollock. So these men were in no way cowards or trying to shirk. This fantastic photograph was taken on the lawn of the War Hospital in 1917, and it was donated to the collection by the daughter of a lady who nursed at Craiglockhart after her death. There were a series of 3 photographs taken by Bambrith of Edinburgh, but this is the only one that we have of all the main characters in the War Hospital. And in the middle, you see the commanding officer, William Bryce, who was very relaxed about the way that the hospital was run. There was an inspection at one time, and Bryce decided that he wasn't going to clean the place up. He was going to let the military see the hospital as it really was. Sassoon says that you couldn't see your face in the frying pan. So the military weren't too pleased with Bryce. They said he was much too relaxed. The regime wasn't tough enough. And he was actually replaced in 1917, late in 1917, by someone who was much more of a disciplinarian. But all the officers loved Major Bryce. The other person that we'll come to speak about later is Dr. William Halse Rivers, who was a senior psychiatrist at the hospital and was Sassoon's doctor. And on the right-hand side, Dr. Arthur Brock, who was Wilfred Owen's doctor, but we'll speak more of these men in a few minutes. You also see the matron sitting in the front row, matron Margaret McBean, who's described in various writings as the fiery matron, because she didn't really like military authority. So the only person that she showed any respect to, apparently, was Dr. Rivers. The third of the commanding officers of Craig Lockhart did try to have her replaced, but she was having none of that. She said she would have a board of inquiry before she would be replaced. And I think it was just because she was a professional nurse. You know, she wasn't a VAD, she wasn't a military nurse as such. So her ideas of nursing and perhaps the military's maybe weren't quite the same thing. The picture itself shows only a few officers at the hospital, because bearing in mind there was more than 160 officers, these men would have been the ones who were well enough to be treated downstairs. Siegfried Sassoon says that there were lots of patients who were too ill to be seen downstairs, so they wouldn't have been included in the photograph. But if you look closely at it, and I don't know if you'll see from where you're sitting, in the upper windows that you can just see the shadow of nurses who are looking out. So they would still have been inside the hospital looking after the patients. When the officers were outside the building, they had to wear blue bands on their uniforms, and they had to wear uniform at all times. This was a military hospital, not a Red Cross hospital. So they wore blue bands when they went outside. And last year at the Edinburgh International Book Festival, when I gave a talk there, one gentleman came up and he said, "That's my father in the front row." So 100 years after this photograph was taken, someone new was identified, which was fantastic for us. We also did find on the lawn a fungus which is unknown in Scotland. And the idea that seems to have come from this fungus being found on the lawn is that perhaps it was brought back from Europe by the boots of some of the soldiers who were there. I'm not quite sure how much truth there is in that, but the Botanic Garden Herbarium has certainly recognised the species of fungus, and it's certainly not a Scottish one. So this is arguably the most famous face of Craig Lockhart War Hospital. This is Wilfred Owen. Wilfred was 24 years old and a second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. He'd been blown up at the Western Front and left in a railway cutting for some considerable time with the body parts of a dead comrade, Lieutenant Gout Roger, beside him. He was noticeably affected by this horrific incident and was described afterwards as being shaky. He was sent to the 13th Casualty Clearing Station in France and wrote to his mother on the 2nd of May 1917. The doctor suddenly was moved to forbid me to go into action next time the battalion goes, which will be in a day or two. I did not go sick or anything, but he is nervous about my nerves and sent me down yesterday, labelled neurasthenia. Wilfred Owen was sent back to Britain to recover and was admitted to Craig Lockhart War Hospital on the 26th of June 1917 to be treated for his neurasthenia. When he says labelled neurasthenia as well, he may be actually saying labelled, because men who were injured at the front used to have a label attached to them, and it would describe what was wrong with them, so it was literally labelled. The men used to call it a ticket. And we're fortunate we have one in the collection, not Wilfred Owen's, I hasten to add, but someone who had influenza, and the ticket was attached to the officer so that the details were passed down the line from the moment they were injured right up to when they were treated in hospital. Wilfred noted at his arrival in hospital, "There is nothing very attractive about the place. It is a decayed hydro, far too full of officers, some of whom I know. Despite that, Wilfred played an active part in life at the hospital, joining the field club, acting in the theatricals, debating, teaching, and of course writing. Wilfred subsequently called Craiglocker this excellent concentration camp. His doctor was this man, Dr. Arthur John Brock. Dr. Brock used ergotherapy, or the work cure, as a form of occupational therapy. The idea that Brock had, and he was a great believer in the work of Patrick Geddes, the great Scottish polymath. Sorry for that. He believed that his treatments would reconnect the person who was being treated to his environment, and that would be beneficial for recovery. So Dr. Brock would find something that you were interested in and try and build your recovery process around your interests. So it's really quite an individual treatment that he was offering. Dr. Brock himself was described as being very tall, thin, hunched up shoulders, big blue hands, very chilly looking with a long peaked nose that should have had a drip on the point, a high-pitched voice suggestive of the Arctic regions, full of energy, pushed his patients out of bed on the dark cold mornings and marched them out for a walk before breakfast. Rumour has it that they bolted themselves into lavatories and bathrooms, but he was wise to that. One officer boasted that if he lay flat under his bed so that the untidy bedclothes hid him, as if he were an early riser, he escaped. I think that Dr. Brock was the perfect choice for Wilfred Owen. Dr. Brock encouraged what we would now call creative writing, and this has provided us with a unique legacy, the Hydra, the magazine of Craiglocker War Hospital. We are really fortunate in having, unfortunately not the originals of the old series of the Hydra, but we do have digitised copies. This image is of Wilfred Owen's own copy, which is held in Oxford University. So you can see the cover is the building with an officer in front of it. This gave us a record of all the activities that went on and were available to the officers, all the clubs, the important visitors to the building, such as the Premier of Canada. People were encouraged to submit cartoons, poems, and the results of sporting events, such as golf matches. Wilfred Owen edited 6 copies while he was at Craiglocker. In one of his editorials he says, "Many of us who came to the Hydro slightly ill are now getting dangerously well." One of the most significant announcements, for Owen particularly, was recorded in the Hydra in August 1917. It was the arrival of 2nd Lieutenant Siegfried Sassoon of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. The second cover for the Hydra, of which was absolutely fantastic, just as Wilfred was about to leave the hospital because he was discharged in the October in 1917, he says that the printing block for the old series of the Hydra is wearing done. He says, and as for the editor, ... which kind of gives you a glimpse into his state of mind, even although he was being returned to active service. They had a plea in the Hydra for someone to come forward and design a new cover. So this cover, which is probably the one most associated with Craiglocker War Hospital, was designed by Lieutenant Adrian Berrington. And as you can see, he's got an officer being blown up and being held by the mythological Greek Hydra. So it's a kind of play of words on the hydropathic and the Hydra monster. And you can see the 2 nurses guarding the officer and being taken into the safety of Craiglocker. I think it's quite telling that one nurse has a bottle of something and the other one has what looks like a cup of tea, so nothing really changes after all these years. but we have 3 original copies in the collection, which is wonderful. One really important item that we have is a book called The Old Huntsman, which was a book of poetry published by Sassoon just before he came into the hospital. The copy that we own is Wilfred Owen's own first copy. It's the copy that he had read before he had the chance to introduce himself to Sassoon. We were a bit puzzled as to why it didn't have Sassoon's signature as well, because the story goes that he signed all of Wilfred's copies, but this one we think was left at home, which is why it doesn't have Siegfried's signature on it. But this is one of our real treasures. So the scene is set really. Owen is already in hospital in June 1917, and Sassoon arrives. Owen was aware of his poetry, and he then tries to get himself introduced to his hero, Sassoon, because Sassoon is a published poet. So, using this book by way of introduction, the 2 men first met in 1917 in August at some point. We're not sure of the exact date. But Siegfried Sassoon describes the meeting, saying, "There was a gentle knock on the door of my room, and a young officer entered. Short, dark-haired and shyly hesitant, he stood for a moment before coming across to the window, where I was sitting on my bed cleaning my golf clubs." Sassoon goes on, "It amuses me to remember when I resumed my ruminative club polishing. I wondered whether his poems were any good." They soon became firm friends, connected by the common bond of poetry. Sassoon encouraged Owen to write poems, but to ditch the flowery stuff and to write about the war that he had seen at the front. He said, "Sweat your guts out writing poetry." And as a result of this, most of the famous literary poems that we think of that we were taught at school, Dulce et Decorum Est and Anthem for Doomed Youth, were drafted at Craiglockhart. The young officer indeed found his unique poetic voice. Am I okay for time? Siegfried Sassoon, of course, the other fantastic celebrated poet of the First World War, was from a hugely wealthy family, the Sassoons, the banking Sassoons of the Far East. But it wasn't only his father's family who were influential, it was also his mother's family. His mother's family were well connected. They were creative and artistic. His uncle was Sir Hamo Thornycroft, who was a fantastic bronze sculptor. So Siegfried was well represented throughout creativity, the artistic world, the engineering world, and of course the wealth of the Sassoons. As a kind of side note, I should say, Sassoon's family were so wealthy that when his father played the violin, which he played to concert levels, he had not only one, but he had 2 Stradivariuses, or Stradivariani, which we both. Siegfried joined the Sussex Yeomanry very early in the war, and then moved on to a commission in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He was brave, reckless, and a decorated war hero. Although he was awarded the Military Cross, he became disillusioned by the way the war was progressing and being conducted. So he refused in 1917 to return to the front, and he published an anti-war statement. It was published in the Times, and it was discussed in Parliament. It was entitled, "Finished with the War, a Soldier's Declaration." Now, I won't read it all here. It's quite a strong statement, but I'll give you a flavour of it by saying the first couple of sentences. He said, "I am making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it." Now, this was a dangerous move, putting himself in line for a court-martial, quite apart from the fact that it would have upset most of his friends and his family. This gave the military authorities a huge problem what to do with Sassoon. His friend and fellow Royal Welsh Fusilier Robert Graves pleaded on his behalf that perhaps he was psychologically damaged by the war and he should be treated medically rather than court-martialed. So Sassoon also was sent to Craiglockhart. He called Craiglockhart Dottyville, and he said that he was in the hospital and there were 160 officers and they were all half dotty. But his time was spent well at Craiglockhart. He wrote many poems during his time in hospital, resulting in the book called Counterattack. His other passion was, of course, playing golf. Sassoon was treated by Dr. Rivers and discharged from the hospital in 1917 to return to active service. He lived a long life. He lived until 1967. The outcome for Wilfred Owen, of course, was much different. Wilfred returned to the front and was killed on the Sambre-Oise Canal on the 4th of November, 1918. His mother heard of his death when the armistice bells were ringing. She was delivered of the telegram. The third of the quotes that Neil will talk about is, of course, Robert von Ranke-Graves. Graves escorted his friend Sassoon, or was detailed to escort his friend Sassoon to hospital, but Graves missed the train and turned up 4 hours after his escort, his detail. So Graves came back to Edinburgh though and did visit, which Neil will talk about later. But just so that you know what Graves looks like, he of course wrote goodbye to all that in 1929, and of course books like I, Claudius and The White Goddess were his later works. He again lived a long life, much of it spent in Mallorca, in Dea. But I'll leave Graves to Neil. This cartoon comes from the Hydra and is of Dr. Rivers, the wizard of Craiglockhart, who treated Siegfried Sassoon. This is very much an in-joke because the banner on top of Dr. Rivers is actually the 6 rivers of the underworld, but only someone with a classical education would know that. It took me years. I was educated in St David's in Dalkeith. I had no idea what this was about. But the men are playing on the word of Dr. Rivers, and they're having an in-joke. So it wasn't all doom and gloom in the hospital. But Rivers himself used a different treatment. He used psychotherapies, the talking cure. So Sassoon's treatments were very, very different from Owen's treatment. But Sassoon had a great bond with his doctor. He was almost a father figure to Sassoon and a great mentor. Dr. Rivers died sadly in 1922, and both Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves wrote poems dedicated to Dr. Rivers. And this one particularly, What Voice Revisits Me This Night, just shows the strength of the bond that these men had. I'm quite aware of my time, so I'm going to just very briefly skip through the next two slides. The War Poets collection, particularly since Pat Barker wrote so beautifully of Sassoon's time at Craiglockhart, now has widened to include any inpatient, any medical member of staff, any nurse, any information we can get about the history of Craiglockhart War Hospital. And one of the patients who was here at the same time as Sassoon and Owen was Captain Arthur Davis. Davis wouldn't go to war apparently unless his uniform was tailor-made by his own tailor. He didn't like military tailoring at all. So we like to remember and keep photographs of people who were at the hospital. The little girl who's saluting him became an actress when she grew up, and she was in The French Lieutenant's Woman with Meryl Streep and Jeremy Irons. So we like to remember Arthur J. Davis, who was a bilingual architect. David Louis Clementson, another patient at Craiglockhart War Hospital, was one of the very, very few black officers in the British Army. He came from the West Indies, he was Jamaican. He was a student at Cambridge University and was sent to the front. He had malaria, shell shock. He was torpedoed on the way to Craiglockhart. He was picked up and eventually got to Craiglockhart. He was cured and sent back to the front, and he was killed 2 months before the end of the war. So we have remembered, on a more contemporary note, we have remembered also the poets themselves in the work of Steve Burnett, the violin maker, who crafted the Wilfred Owen violin, the Siegfried Sassoon violin, and the Robert Graves violin from one piece of sycamore taken from a tree in the campus. They're fantastic instruments and have been acknowledged by Nigel Kennedy and Maxim Vengerov. So this last 4 years has seen a lot of performances of the Wilfred Owen violin, mainly in the name of peace and reconciliation. And as Neil said, we had a reconstruction of Wilfred Owen's arrival in Edinburgh. And our latest purchase, a manuscript of Aftermath, a poem by Siegfried Sassoon, whose lines have the words, "Have you forgotten yet? Swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget." And I do hope that Edinburgh Napier University has not forgotten our heritage. The collection is open for the public. Please do come and visit here in the area, because really we collect for the future and for everyone, not just for our students and academics. So on that note, I'm going to hand you to a proper academic, to Neil, and thank you very much for your attention.
Huge thank you to Catherine. It's been a joy to work with Catherine over, goodness, 4 or 5 years ago we started this journey, particularly picked up last year with the events last year. I was a former history teacher. I know that history people will love it or they hate it. It all depends on the quality of the teacher. I'm sure they'll agree. Catherine was just a fantastic boon to have at these events to help to set the context of Craig Lockhart and how the war poets came to be in Scotland during the Great War. Now, one of the things that I was consciously aware of as my time as a history teacher before I moved into the world of academia and universities is that history is constantly changing, our interpretations of it are changing, our view of it's changing, and we're always looking for new angles on particular topics and themes. And as regards to that, I was particularly keen to move on new angles on the work of Wilfred Owen, surveying what we knew already and trying to add some new knowledge and new interpretations to this magnificent war poet. As I say, it's been a great pleasure over the last 5 years to chair the committee who put on the sequence of events, including this magnificent walk along Princes Street, which I was heading to Craig Lockhart one night to deliver a lecture. The taxi driver said there was this walk along Princes Street. The Lord Provost was at the front, and there was a Reconstruction soldier, and there was pipers. And said, yeah, that was us that arranged that. It was fantastic, the scale of interest in the events. So the remains of tonight, the second half of tonight, I want to talk a little bit more about Wilfred Owen himself, talk a little bit about how he happened to be in Scotland with the other two great war poets that you've heard about, Sassoon and Graves, and then talk specifically about how during the Great War for Civilization, others were out looking for the great drive onto the fairway, and there's a Gulf connection between all of this which sees the three of them coming together. It's important we do give a bit of context to Wilfred Owen, and Catherine set a bit of it in context there. I still go to events sometimes and give the presentation, and someone will say halfway through it, sorry, who's Wilfred Owen? One of our committee members went to a meeting to set up some of the events. 15 minutes into the meeting, someone said, I've never heard of Wilfred Owen. So it's important we do set that in context. Furthermore, there are multiple misperceptions about Wilfred Owen. There was an interesting and heated exchange on the Scottish Poetry Library's social media, and they do have heated exchanges on their social media feeds. And it was particularly around about a comment that someone had said, where they said that Owen was just a posh English schoolboy. Now, as regards to that, a couple of things. First of all, he was far from posh. And secondly, he was greatly influenced by his time here in Scotland. It was an influential time in his writing. The work of the committee hopefully has helped to raise awareness of that so they can see the Scottish connections. But some of the other work we've been engaged in that you may be interested in is the Scottish war poets. And we have a number of plaques across the country to commemorate some of the Scottish war poets. Charles Hamilton Sorley in Dundee, Mary Simons in Dufftown, and very near to here, Joseph Lee, the Scottish war poet from the First and the Second World War in Dundee. So we have a number of commemorative plaques that will be going up around the country later this year to make sure that there's a balance between the great war poets that we know, the English war poets, Owen, Sassoon and Graves, but also of the Scottish war poets as well. So, Wilfred Owen, as we said, born on the 18th of March 1893 in Oswestry in Shropshire. Perhaps a strange coincidence, he was born in the same year that Baberton Golf Club, the scene of the specific meeting that we're going to talk about, was formed. So it's an interest, there's all these strange coincidences as we go through. He was the eldest son of Tom and Susan Owen, and Tom worked on the railways. He was a railway worker, Shropshire lad, and far from a privileged upbringing. The house they were in was a reasonable house when he was born, but that came from his grandfather's wealth. But when Edward Shaw, the grandfather, died, the family had to move to the back streets of Birkenhead. There was a sporting connection in the family, and his uncle Edward Shaw had a sporting connection, and that he played international football for Wales. And his Welsh team lost one game to Scotland. They got beaten 4-1 in a match that was played in Glasgow in 1884. But that apart, the Owen family was a regular family, getting on with their life and their daily business, and they moved again. They moved to Shrewsbury again because of Tom's work on the railways. He moved around a fair bit. That broke Owen's education. He moved to Birkenhead Institute and Shrewsbury Technical School, and he did apply for university. He applied to the University of London and passed the matriculation exam. But he didn't get the first that was required to get a scholarship. And given his family were not a wealthy family, that made it challenging for him to go to university given the economic circumstances. There was nothing he wanted more than was to go to university and to go to Oxford. That was the university that Owen particularly wanted to go to. But we'll see that later he called Craiglocker and he called Edinburgh his free and easy Oxford. It became almost like a university debating club. It became like a university common room almost, the way in which he was interacting both at the War Hospital but across Edinburgh with some of the enlightened figures of the time he was connecting in with and meeting with. So after his school education, Owen went to work. And first of all, he worked as a vicar's assistant, where in return for his work, he received free housing, but also some free tutoring as well. He seemed to be trying to better himself educationally, and his interest started to expand to botany and to literature. You can see a progression in his interest in literature and what he's reading over a period of time. At the same time, he visited France in 1912. He was working as a private tutor in France, and he had his first trip to Scotland. His family came to Kelso. They had family friends in Kelso, and it was a cheap summer holiday for the family because they could stay at the friend's house, and of course Tom with his railway work could get cheap, if not free, railway tickets. So a family holiday to Kelso was affordable for the family. And he went to Edinburgh. He spent some time in Edinburgh as part of that holiday. We'll see that that's quite an important period later on when he was in Kelso in 1912. The First World War starts. We heard that Sassoon started up, joined up very early. Owen didn't rush to join up. He joined a little bit later in October 1915, and he joined the Artist Rifles. In 1916, he's commissioned second lieutenant in the Manchesters. And during that time, he becomes a casualty very soon. His first time as a casualty is a result of falling into a shell hole. It's a relatively minor wound. It's patched up, and he's put back to the front again relatively quickly. Then, as you heard from Catherine, something altogether worse happens to him, and he's blown up by a trench mortar, and he spends days unconscious in the carnage of the First World War, which now reaped the French and Belgian countryside around. And coming to you, as you've heard, the remains of his fellow Second Lieutenant Guy Roger are surrounding him, and he's then diagnosed as having tropical. He's then diagnosed as having what we would call shell shock today. So he's sent back to initially one of the two reception centres. There's all these coincidences. So there's two reception centres he can be sent to, and he's sent to the Welsh Hospital in Netley. And then from there are 6 hospitals he could then be triaged to for his treatment. And it just happens he's then sent to Craiglocker in Edinburgh, which of course centre of enlightenment thinking, the centre of literature today, the capital city of literature. So there's all these coincidences that are really fortunate for him, I guess, in terms of where he ends up. Had he ended up somewhere in the country, would he have written the same poetry that we know today? Would he have had the influences to do that? Would he have had the golf meeting that we're going to come to? Certainly he wouldn't have had that. So, Owen had started his poetry as a young boy. Don't think that he just starts his poetry in the First World War. That's not unusual. During that era, many people scribbled notes in poetic form. It was a regular form of communication, recording their thoughts. Perhaps a notebook was the Twitter and Facebook of today. Maybe we should actually go back to just having notebooks and people putting their thoughts in notebooks rather than broadcasting them across social media. So Owen certainly, though, did want his work to be published so other people could read his work. And he's known particularly for not only the power of his poetry, but the pararhyme approach that he uses, a very unique approach that he uses in his poetry. And one of the things that we see in that is that the pararhyme approach comes from his time in Scotland. He starts to read books in 1912 in Scottish history, and you can see from his underlines in the books that he's starting to underline words that are potential for poetry, and he then transfers it into his poetry. So reading Scottish history books inspires him to go ahead. So my own interest in this all started when I was the head of history at Tynecastle High School in Edinburgh. And at the school in Edinburgh, there's a wonderful resource in the headmaster's log for the school. The headmaster's log records daily events that happen in the school, in the community, and also any visitors to the school. And it's almost like a captain's log of a ship. Sadly today, they don't hold such resources in schools because everything now is electronic management information. It's all data about people's, rather than the sort of holistic story of what's going on in people's lives, teachers' lives, and also the whole school life. And we see this magnificent entry here in September 1917, where the headmaster has logged in the notebook that 4 officers have come from Craiglock War Hospital to teach at Tynecastle High School. One of them is going to teach first aid, one of them is going to teach physical training, one of them is going to teach signalling, and the other one's going to teach English literature. Guess which one Wilfred Owen is from that list? So Brock had set him up to go and do a bit of teaching in the school to aid his recovery from shell shock, to get him back into normal working life, get him back interacting with people, and get him back speaking and something he's passionate about, English literature and writing. And we can tally that up to his letters. One of his letters just after this says, "This morning I gave my first lesson in a course of English literature in a big school!" Exclamation mark. And that big school is Tynecastle High School. And he says, "I have 39 boys." There was no small class sizes back then. 39 boys to entertain, if you like. And he says in that they were most intelligently attentive. No different to the pupils that I taught there almost 100 years later when I was teaching there. So he returned many times to the school, and he was clearly liked by staff and students. When he was there, we can see that young people really responded to him. He went back there later in the war, and they were making cards for him, Christmas cards for him, and they had presents of cigarettes and whiskey for him. So he was clearly, for a temporary teacher, well liked by the pupils in the school. So, we talked about the fact that there's a number of finds that we made. 2 of the finds before we get to the golf course meeting. One is the fact that his pararhyme approach, finding the fact that the Scottish history book and his reading of it sparked this different interest in poetry and how you can play with words, play with the way that the rhyme happens in the poem. The second thing is we found in the copies of the Hydra, the hospital magazine, people had believed that Owen had written a handful of poems that had been published in his lifetime. Now, the British Library claimed it was 4 published, the Wilfred Owen Association claimed it was 5. We can find a 6th one. We can find in his editorial, in an introduction, he writes the start of a poem that he later expands upon. So he actually had 6 poems published in his lifetime. But as we know, most of his poems were more significant after the war, after his death, and particularly during the Vietnam War era, when there was an anti-war movement, worldwide anti-war movement, and people were having an interest in the anti-war poets from the First World War. Now, these are important finds for Edinburgh history, and they're important finds for literature history, but the one that became of interest for golf history was finding this connection between Owen, Graves and Sassoon meeting at a golf club. And it's grown arms and legs. There's a further inquiry, which we'll tell you just now in a moment or two, which is leading to more finds from that particular meeting. So the Oxford-based scholar, Dominic Hibbard, floated the idea, in fact he cited in his book that he believed that this meeting, this powerful meeting had happened at Barberton Golf Club. But very strangely for an Oxford academic of high standard, he didn't reference it. He had no source that he found it in, so it became difficult to verify. Was it Barberton Golf Club that held this very powerful meeting between the three men? I corresponded with Dominic Hibbard before he sadly died, and he himself began to doubt if it was Barberton Golf Club. He couldn't remember where he found it, he couldn't remember if it was an assumption. So that then sparked me in my own research, going to both Oxford, London, and regularly to the archives in the United States, particularly in Austin, Texas, not only to generally be looking at the war poet's life, but specifically to try and find this meeting venue. Was it a meeting venue at a golf club, and if so, why and how did this happen? Now, we went backwards and forwards to Barberton Golf Club itself, who have an excellent set of archives, including the minute books. Their minute books are just fantastic, great resources, and some really lovely stories of where, well, I'm saying lovely stories, I'm speaking to golfers here, we'll be in the main, where parts of the golf course were ripped up to be used as look at other ways to feed the nation. But more importantly, the challenge for them during the First World War is how do we get enough whisky supplies for the bar? And that comes through regulating committee meetings as a challenge as to how do we make sure the bar is adequately stocked. But sadly, there was no mention, other than that, yes, there was officers who played golf at the club, there's no specific mention of who it was and when it was, and there's no visitors book, which causes a real problem for us to look at. However, on one of my trips to Oxford, to Austin, I had a wonderful conversation with the archivist there. And during that conversation, she said, I'm going to take you around, I've been to Austin many times, I'm going to take you around and show you some of the real gems we've got hidden behind the paper archives. We've got a whole load of other things here you'll be fascinated to see. And she took me around. The archive in Austin has a number of sporting and also sort of cultural and arts-based items. It has all the costumes from Gone with the Wind, for example, are all held in that archive. There are Civil War swords there. Some of the gems that she showed me, she took me to the Arthur Conan Doyle collection, where I got to hold Arthur Conan Doyle's golf clubs that were in the collection, and also his Ouija board, which is in there, although that one I was holding a little bit further away than the golf clubs. Now, as a thank you for that, I took her out for lunch, and when we went to lunch, she noted there was a new book that had letters between Sassoon and Blunden. And she knew that I'd lectured many years before in Oxford, and Blunden's family had been the audience, and was determined to show me this book. So I took it away and had a number of reads of it. So I thought, I need to go back through all of my research notes and start from scratch and see if there's any loose ends that I've missed out. And there was two loose ends that came to fruition. One was in the NHS archives, where I made an inquiry with them, and they told me there's nothing in the box that you're looking for. And I went back and presented myself in person to the archive and went into the box, and lo and behold, there was lots in the box I was looking for, including the rules of Craiglock War Hospital, which themselves were fascinating to find the rules that the soldiers or the officers were to abide by when they were there. The other one came, the other research of a previous inquiry came as I was sitting in the bar in Gleneagles. So again, there's a golfing connection. And I was sitting, I had one of these eureka moments with a whisky again, may I add. So whisky is definitely helping research here. That I hadn't followed through on an email that I'd sent to Southern Illinois University about a specific letter, and I was convinced that that letter would hold the clue as to why is it the golf course became the venue for this meeting. And in a flurried email exchange, this letter turned up. What we have is a letter in October where Sassoon is writing to Graves. Graves was planning to come and visit Sassoon in Edinburgh, and he said, "Delighted to see you, however, I'm really sorry, old boy, I have a golf match." And he's always saying to him, "You're welcome to come, but I have a golf match." And in the letter he describes the fact that the golf match must go ahead. He's playing with a doctor, and we know that he played regularly with a doctor, and he was his golfing partner, and he cannot possibly let this man down. Particularly as this man had also suffered in the war. As a doctor, he'd been torpedoed on the SS Transylvania, which we'll come back to, because that becomes important later on. So we now have the absolute clue that cements that this meeting took place at Barberton Golf Club, whereby Graves arrives from down south, gets his training to Edinburgh, and then he's then escorted, this time by Owen, and Owen takes him to Barberton Golf Club. The golf game's going on, Sassoon and the doctor playing together, and once Sassoon's finished, he then joins the others, and the three of them are now together. You've now got the three most powerful poets together at that time. Now you might say, and so what? What is the significance of that? Well, it's significant from 2 points of view. One, just before that meeting, Owen had scripted as first verse of Dulce et Decorum Est, the well-known gas poem, and just after the meeting he rescripts it and makes it significantly better. So there's a connection there between them. At this point, I'm going to ask Catherine to read that poem, which I'm sure many of you will remember.
Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
So we see the meeting straddling this drafts of this powerful poem. We also see it's important because Graves obviously really took to Owen in this meeting. By January, there is a wedding. Robert Graves is marrying Nancy Nicholson, and he invites this gentleman who he's met once at Barberton Golf Club to the wedding. Now that's significant for Owen because he's then at that particular wedding introduced to some of the literature set of the time. So it allows him access to publishers, key figures, and again helps to raise the fact that people are aware of his work, and then when he dies after the war, people have remembered him and make sure they publish him and promote his work. Now, the story of Barberton Golf Club doesn't stop there with the First World War. The course, of course, sits on the land of Sir James Gibson Craig, a family who know very, very well the sacrifice of war. And that story could be told, a whole lecture could be told about that particular aspect of the golf club. The club, however, has a strong association with the military. And today, every year, they play for a trophy, the HLI Cup, the Highland Light Infantry Cup. And it's still played for, it still sits in the trophy cabinet as a marker of the links with the 3rd Battalion of the Highland Light Infantry, who were based up in the Lenny camp at Balerno. And the soldiers returned backwards and forwards to the club to play, but also to help with maintenance of the golf course, because of course the greenkeepers were at war. So there was a mutual partnership between the two at that time. Of course, at that time they didn't know the significance of the 3 people who were meeting there in 1917. But the patients at Craiglocker, they started to play at Baberton Golf Club. Now, up until that point, they hadn't played there. They played at Morton Hall, which was a nearby course. Now, Morton Hall had claimed that they held the meeting of Owen, Grace and Sassoon. It's written in their 100th anniversary, their centenary history. They had a plaque made for 2017 able to place in the golf club to say this meeting took place, until we found this letter and could divert and say it wasn't Morton Hall, it was actually Baberton Golf Club. So the patients did play at Morton Hall. We know that they certainly played there. Sassoon notes it in Sherston's Progress. Owen probably met with him there, although Owen was not a golfer, but he went and followed Sassoon around. But Sassoon wanted to get himself further away from, as we heard described earlier, Dotyville, or as Regeneration described it. One of the characters describes it as the Louisman. So Sassoon didn't see himself as a shell-shock victim, he didn't see himself as a normal patient. He didn't set out and play golf elsewhere. He actually said at one point that he probably played golf in most of the clubs in the area. He certainly played in North Berwick, and he started to play in other clubs, hence why Baberton became the place. He played at Baberton with his doctor friend on the 30th of October, which was said a survivor of the Transylvania ship sinking. Christine Walker and Alan Nimmo, Christine Nimmo and Alan Walker have taken on now to find more about who was that doctor. We reckon, maybe for our future lesson, we reckon they found exactly who Sassoon's golfing partner was from that time. But we're going to reveal more of that on the 13th of October at a lecture at Baberton Golf Club. So as we say, Sassoon was a trendsetter, he was absolutely a trendsetter. He wanted to pitch out himself. He wanted to move away from Craiglocker War Hospital to play at Baberton. And Sassoon didn't want to mix with the riffraff of others, but it seemed that others started to follow him. So in the late September edition of the Hydro, we see what we would not want patients doing when they're on the golf course, because the golf section of the War Hospital magazine says,
"We should like to point out that only real golf clubs can be accepted. During the past week, several merchants have turned up with weird-looking weapons, which they glibly describe as old masters, but there's nothing doing. It's golf clubs we want, not hockey bats."
And the magazine goes on to say,
"Will beginners please endeavour to read up on the rules of golf, and particularly golf etiquette. There are many pitfalls for the ignorant, and since the various clubs in the district extend full hospitality to us, to offend unwittingly would be very galling to any member of the Hydro. Very often, apologies do not heal the sores caused by indiscretions."
This is reinforced again in June 1918. Members are reminded of 4 aspects of golf etiquette.
The first, do not drive until the players in front have played their second shot or are well out of reach. 2, do not attempt to even a long shot on a green until those in front have replaced the pin. 3, do not practice putting on the green when there are other couples waiting to approach. 4, always replace the turf.
This is clearly causing the golfing society of the War Hospital a real concern.
It has several times been reported to me, both officially and unofficially, that officers will persist in driving into other players. This is looked upon by golfers everywhere as the essence of bad sportsmanship. So remember the sporting manner in which we are treated by the council and members of the local merchants of Edinburgh Golf Club. We should do all we can to show them that we appreciate their kindness, and also that we do not forget that we are their guests on the course and do our utmost in return by playing the game.
In November 1917, the Golfing Society, who maybe make themselves a little bit unpopular at some of the courses, are looking for new venues. They do consider a trip here to St Andrews, although we don't believe the trip took part. However, Siegfried Sassoon incorporates St Andrews into one of his own poems.
David Cleek by Siegfried Sassoon. I cannot think that death will press his claim to snuff you out or put you off your game. You'll still contrive to play your steady round through hurricanes may sweep the dismal ground and darkness blur the sandy skirted green where silence gulfs the shot you strike so clean. St Andrew, guard your ghost, old David Cleek, and send you home to Fifeshire once a week. Good fortune speed your ball upon its way when heaven decrees its mightiest medal day. Till saints and angels hymn for evermore the miracle of your astounding score, and he who keeps all players in his sight, walking the royal and ancient hills of light, standing benignant at the 18th hole, to everlasting golf consigns your soul.
By December, Craiglockett War Hospital Golf Society had several sets of clubs. There was no need for the weapon-like instruments that we're using in earlier rounds. And Mr. Waterhouse, the club secretary, can give them out on loan, and golf balls can also be purchased at Craiglockett War Hospital at the tobacco stall. Beginners can be helped by representatives to save the embarrassment from earlier on. And in the same edition, we see Babberton beaten by what is now an emerging officer golf academy. The hospital magazine, The Hydro, notes.
We gave Babberton a glimpse of hydro prowess by playing a foursomes competition there. It is a long course with good golf abounding, but no really difficult holes to tire such weary folks as we are. Most of the shots require placing, particularly the sixth, where a fluffed shot places the ball in a position likely to cause its player the utmost astonishment. Playing good golf together, Lieutenant Shadwick and Lieutenant Brooke walked off with the first prize and left Lieutenant Walker and Lieutenant Boak to console themselves with the second memento. Oh, what tales we heard in the clubhouse afterwards. How drives do grow in the smoky atmosphere of the steward's domain. And the stories of hardship endured. You know the sort. They start like this. Well, at the fifth, you got a fair drive and a bad lie. But I took my brassy and hit the mortar right over the trees, over the quarry, across the stream, and plunk onto the green by the pin, and then my partner missed the putt.
The same edition of the magazine sees a Scottish war poet and Craiglockett patient, Arbroath-born Jai B. Salmon, write a short story called A Pair of Trousers, a Golfing Tale. That story again I'm going to leave to try to encourage you to go to Craiglockett, hopefully come along to the book festival events later, which we'll explain them in more detail. But in January 1918, the officers at Craiglockett War Hospital note that despite the weather, golf still continues and is one of the most popular activities at the hospital. No fair weather golfers during wartime. The demand for striking starts to exceed supply, and many new members who have joined now have handicaps. Nevertheless, the behaviour of some is still a challenge, and in May 1918, the magazine notes,
It is hard to keep one's temper when learning. Instead of counting to 10 before you speak, try counting the number of strokes you make before you hit the ball.
Nevertheless, one patient's game is clearly improving.
One of our most enthusiastic beginners was, until recently, always to be found within the sound of the click of ivory balls, whereas nowadays he peruses the elusive rubber corded ones of sorts with really astonishing success. He certainly derives much amusement from this new game, and his always cheery laugh has, if possible, increased in volume.
A satirical piece in June 1918 edition notes an extract from the fictional Second Lieutenant Pepys, RFA Territorial, who notes some similar successes.
Played the game of golf and did not lose my ball.
Babberton, however, is said to be the most suitable course for the war hospital patients, and particularly for average players?
Chiefly because a slice or pool does not receive the punishment it deserves, and consequently there is little chance of losing balls.
So Baberton Golf Club, famed for the Horsburgh steel shafted club which sits downstairs in this very museum. It was made at Coburn Smithy at Glenbrook Road, west of Balerno, can now add the most powerful literary meeting of the 20th century to its history books, and the support of men in the First World War who were recovering from shell shock started to get back to normality by taking a round of golf. It takes it full circle, and last year we placed a plaque at the site of the old Baberton Golf Club house, which is now no longer there, sadly. It's been removed. There's now a new residential home there, but that is the site of the meeting. There's this wonderful photograph taken just before the war of the 18th green, and you can see the clubhouse up in the background there in the photograph. So we can see Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves all walking in that golf club to discuss some of the most powerful poetry that we know today from the First World War. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening you've been most gracious with your attention, and before we go into question and answers, I want to just reiterate some particular lines from Siegfried Sassoon's poetry on golf.
To everlasting golf consigns your soul.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.